Well, hello and welcome back to the Regiment Chronicles. Thanks for joining us again for episode 4. I'm coming to you before the actual podcast to let you know that today's a bit of a longer episode, about 30 minutes long. Today I'm talking with Eric Dawson, my Spanish teacher from Kent Denver School here in Denver, Colorado, and we're talking about the importance of language. Please enjoy. Well, hello and welcome back to the Regiment Chronicles. Thanks for joining us again. We've got a really special episode for you today, the first episode in a new series that we're starting here on the Regiment Chronicles, Teacher Talks. And I'm joined by a very special teacher today, my Spanish teacher, Senor Dawson. He's an amazing individual. He works at my school, Kent, and he graduated from Guilford College, Quaker Institute. He went to grad school at the University of Miami in Ohio. He's published several pieces of writing. Number one, How to Be Irresistible at Colleges.
The college book, by the way, came from when I was a college counselor, and I'd worked with our former director of college counseling, and it got some nice. What I didn't realize at the time was that we would need to do a whole lot of, and Twitter was new at the time, but we're going to have to do tweeting and marketing and do all this kind of stuff for it. And being full-time teachers, we just didn't have the time for it. So we started to go down that world, and we did a couple book talks with it. But anyway, all that is to say, and I'd be happy to talk about stories, but we do have some other phenomenal writers on our campus. So anyway, that's
that's
not
interesting.
To reflect.
No, that's cool.
I enjoy writing, enjoy reading, all that. Yeah,
that's good. And I just wanted to talk also here about your family. Your parents are retired Spanish professors from the University of Richmond, and they wrote a best-selling college Spanish textbook that has revolutionized how Spanish has been taught. It's, I believe, now in its 10th edition. You and your family
well,
also.
I think it's past that. Yeah.
And
I don't know if you know how textbooks work, but they have to redo textbooks every few years with new editions, and that's really for the company's profit, because otherwise it's just used edition. But also is to update and modify and things like that. My parents, I'm kind of proud of them, is back in the 70s that they before their textbook, which is called Dicho y Hecho, most of the methods were really kind of primarily either translation method or audiolingual, depending on your language. And I won't get into all the specifics of that kind of stuff, but it was a lot of repetition in the language lab. And they were really some of the cluster of people out there really wanting to get more communicative. And that's a whole approach to language teaching, which gets into kind of specific ideas about language pedagogy, but it was really kind of at the heart trying to have authentic communication. And that book was used by everyone from University of Arizona, which was a big deal, to Harvard, to on down the line. Wow. And they're connected to all kinds of language teachers. So that was always kind of a part of my life. Family curse, we call it.
And I want to get into you and your desire to teach Spanish. But first, I also want to mention that you and your closer family have been involved in a lot of community service, and that you spent a year in an orphanage in Colón, Mexico, before going to graduate school. That's really interesting.
It was my first job out of college, and it was in Colón, Querétaro, Mexico, as you said. And I had done volunteer work at orphanages before, for going a few days a week for a semester or that kind of thing, but I'd never done it as a full-time job. And I ended up being kind of one of the co-directors of the orphanage, but I will say that was the hardest job. It was crushing, but it was a powerful experience. There's no way you can be prepared for something like that. And again, like I say, volunteering at orphanages was fun, and I'd go in and play with the kids, and I'd go back to my friends in Guadalajara or wherever I was. And that's a different experience when you are the full-time person and you're in charge of discipline. And, I was 22, I guess at the time, 22. And to have a 15-year-old come up who lived on the streets most of his life and say, we're not going to listen to you because you don't hit us. And because that was the world that they knew. And so here I was, coming from a pacifist Quaker school with my classes on nonviolence ethics, being told we're not going to listen to you because you don't hit us. And, one of the first weeks there, we had a blackout and there were riots, but it was a beautiful town, and I made some powerful relationships. And one of my first teacher mentors was there. wonderful man I'm still in contact with. He's an African American man whose father helped build a Panama Canal. He's like
Whoa.
83 now, his mentor teacher, but
Wow.
he's one that there's a whole story. That's a whole podcast to talk about him because he's a character.
Yeah.
Basically, he's somebody who lives in a state of poverty. And every time I saw him, though he was a university of professor in Mexico, he had retired at the time in Mexico.
Yeah.
He was volunteering at the orphanage, coming out every weekday to work with the study hall time and trying to help teach these kids study skills. And that's how I met
Wow.
him. But he had threadbare clothes. A couple times he passed out because he hadn't eaten enough. But then
Oh
it
my.
turns out that he was basically living in poverty. But it turns out that he did share this with me, that he started a scholarship worth several $1,000,000 because he's one of those
Wow.
people who's been saving and investing because he went to University of Montana. So a scholarship for African American students so that they could have the experience that he had had. And he had a very
Right.
positive experience at University of Montana, where he was one of the only Black students there at the time, in the early 60s, when he went. And so anyway, he's not to get sidetracked, but that's a whole
Oh
podcast.
wow.
And
Yeah,
he's a
that
guy
is.
who's a fascinating character, but it relates to like one of your other questions later, like reasons I got into teaching, and meeting people like that along the way who were just kind of became powers in my life and taught me a lot. But yeah.
So one of the first questions that I had was how long have you worked with language? But really, what I've heard so far is that it's been kind of a lifelong passion, having parents that worked on this Spanish book, and then obviously that spoke Spanish to you. But maybe you could talk more about how far back Spanish in your family was.
Well, not, and I didn't really, so I grew up with it kind of, but they didn't speak to me. And I'm trying to
Oh,
find that
okay.
balance with my own daughter. So I would hear it a lot at home, but I didn't grow up with it. And, as kids, you're like with your friends. And so it wasn't until, well, okay, I was exposed to it. I would tag along when they took university students on a trip.
Right.
They took a sabbatical and took me out of kindergarten so they could study the ruins in Mexico. And we lived in Mexico and some rural areas. And my father just wanted to study pre-Columbian cultures. And so we did
Wow.
that. So those were my first exposures, but it really wasn't until I was in seventh grade. And in seventh grade, I took a trip with my mother to Mexico City. And that was when I discovered the Aztecs. Well, I guess I didn't discover the Aztecs, but I discovered my love and interest in all things pre-Columbian too. And that's when I decided at the time, as a seventh grader, as a middle schooler, I went, either I'm going to be a National Geographic writer or an archaeologist, and I'm going to need Spanish for that. So it kind of needs to come from you. And my daughter is really interested in Spanish now, but I was getting to the point when she was younger, I'd try to teach it or have classes. And it was a little tricky to do immersion because
Right.
Genevieve, Miss Marcelino, my wife, she can get by pretty well, but it would have kind of excluded her from some conversations. And we weren't sure how we were going to manage like an immersion thing at home. There are some parents who do it, but most families who do it well, both parents are speaking Spanish all the time at home.
Right.
Like Dr. Tuma and her husband, they're both full-time Spanish at home. So anyway, all that is to say that I didn't grow up with it. But I was around it kind of indirectly and passively interested, but it wasn't until seventh grade that I decided, oh, this is a thing I want to do. And I think that's what you need to kind of find, that thing that will connect to students. And for some, it'll be the language itself, but for others, it would be something like, it could be the food, it could be pre-Columbian culture, it could be just
Right.
jokes, it could be anything, it could be music, that you find a thing that will bring someone in. But yeah, that was kind of my bridge.
Yeah, that makes sense. And now that was kind of the discovery of Spanish, as that you understood that you would need it later in life if you were going to go down the line
Mm-hmm.
of your passions. But then how did it transition between loving Spanish and wanting to learn Spanish into wanting to teach Spanish to students that were passionate about learning it?
Well, that's where, and so I grew up and with my parents, they're an interesting story too, because my mother was born and raised in Argentina, then Mexico,
Wow.
but her mother was Norwegian and father American.
Oh
So that's a
wow.
whole story. So she was brought up, so real international family. So that's why she knew Spanish, and she was in a Disney movie. That's a whole other story with where they didn't do subtitles at the time. It was a kids movie, but she had to do every scene in Spanish and English. And the movie was called The Littlest Outlaw. So that's her background. But my father was from rural. He's a farming family, but he took Spanish because there was a cute girl in the high school class. And so he signed up and then discovered his love later and university level and professor and all that. And so I was around that. No, and to be clear, too, an interesting part of their journey was, they both retired from the University of Richmond, which is a great school, but my mother spent the majority of her career at Virginia Union, which is a historically Black school. So she was around. It was one day a group of Black Panthers came in and said, "We just want to let you know, Professor Dawson, that we approve of what you're doing." And they left the office, but the Black Panthers wanted to let her know that. But that was kind of formative. So I grew up kind of seeing Virginia Union, historically Black university, and University of Richmond, which is historically a Baptist, Southern Baptist university, which is now kind of disconnected from some of that. Anyway, so that was kind of like with the background, but then discovering, my own interest in the learning, we had a week, let's just say at my high school, Powhatan High School, did not, I don't know what it's like now, but the language program was almost non-existent, and I was with a cluster. I think I was in Spanish 3 as a sophomore, and that was the most advanced. So it was essentially, they didn't know what to do with us. They didn't have that high a level. Right. So it was 3 of us in the corner doing a crossword in Spanish while everyone else, did the lesson. And so it was literally us kind of sitting in the corner. Yeah. So I didn't get really much of anything from high school. So I didn't have much, some nice teachers, but not much in the way of, and it wasn't their fault entirely, but I didn't have much in the way of Spanish teacher models there. It wasn't until I was 15 or 16 that I went to live abroad and on my own. And it was in a beautiful city called Zacatecas, which I guess now there's a lot of cartel action, but at the time, nothing. It's a beautiful, beautiful colonial city. And it's a shame that, it's become more dangerous now, but there was really no one there speaking English when I was there. And so it was a full immersive. I was living with a family and I took little classes and I was fully independent and homesick and all that kind of stuff. But that was a turning point for me. But then your question gets to why teaching? And my parents were both award-winning professors and super popular, and they had a following of students. And so for literally decades, I would have college students come up to me and say, "Your father's the reason I want to major in Spanish," or "Your mother's the reason why I'm a teacher," and all that. But despite all that, you don't want to just follow in your parents' footsteps. Right. So it wasn't because of them. I had grown up saying, I'm not going to be a teacher. I respect what they do, but I'm not going to be a teacher. But it wasn't until college, Guilford College, sweet Quaker place. But I had several professors, a couple in particular, who said, you should be a teacher, but they were subtle about it. They would put little articles on teaching in my mailbox at school. Or there's no such thing. It was a little liberal arts college, so we didn't have TAs. Right. But one said, I want you just to help me with this class. But he didn't need help. He was a master professor. He was brilliant, one of the best teachers ever. But he said, I want you to do a 10-minute lecture, and then let's lead a discussion, and then we'll analyze what you did. So I was kind of provided some of those opportunities. And then, like I told you, the mentor teacher in rural Mexico, Maestro Guillermo is his name. And he will email me to this day with estimado Maestro Dawson. And he refers to me with the title esteemed teacher Dawson. And I refer to him as esteemed teacher Guillermo. And so anyway, those are kind of the pivotal pieces that led to the teaching.
Yeah, that's my mother spent about a year or less in the Basque region of Spain, so different than Latin America. But she did not have a want for a professional career in Spanish, but she had the opinion that her parents wouldn't have let her study abroad for any other reason, and especially because they were so they didn't have the wealth to, fund a trip. So my mom petitioned to my grandparents that she would go live in Spain. And of course they said, no, it's too expensive. So she worked with what little programs there were at her school in Alaska. And she worked with her school to get a scholarship to go to Spain. And again, not for any professional reason, but and I want to get your thoughts on this, because she believed that it was extremely important to learn a language and that she wanted to at a young age. And of course, there's been studies on neuroplasticity and things like that. But I want to get your opinion
Mhm.
on why you think learning a language, if you're going to do it, is so important early on in life.
Well, I will say, yes. And first, I want to hear more about the Basque region. That's where I met Miss Marcelino and all
Oh,
that. And I love
wow.
the Basque and all that. But I'll say, yes, it's super important. The earlier, the better. But I do want to also give a note to people out there. It's never too late. Never too late.
Right.
And I do mean that. And yes, though there is a lot of research that says it can be more difficult for many people, not for all, but for many people to get some of the pronunciation down after like age 12,
Yep, I've
13.
heard that.
It's not impossible. Like, so the pronunciation piece can be a little trickier for some, but
Right.
it's never too late. But with that, it's getting at the heart of why language. So yes, earlier is better with that, with your kind of just how those little young brains are sponges, and you just plop any little kid in another
Right.
country and they'll just take off within a matter of months. And there's no study of grammar, and that's what immersion school models are based on. But essentially, it's at the core, and this will be my thing. And I try to get this out into the world. And if you can get this out in the world and make this soundbite sound interesting, but it's so important to me. And it's not just because I'm a biased language teacher or
Right.
department chair. And I tell students, and you'll hear this speech from me soon to your class when we talk about placements. Like, I don't need people to major in language in college. It's not about that. They certainly don't need to be language teachers if teaching whatever isn't their thing. But I say, you better be studying. Everyone better be studying language. And I don't care if there's
Right.
whatever happens with artificial intelligence and translation, because having language, like unless we get to the point where you can have chips implanted in our brains and they can be immediate, instantaneous, and you're fully assimilating, understanding what's happening. But even with that, I tell people, like, language really is, yes, neuroplasticity and all that, that'll help you and would protect against dementia and everything else. But with professions, I mean, it is profound, the help. The number of, and this isn't just, yes, anecdotally on my level, the number of students over the years who've come back and in medicine, in law, in business, in every kind of business field you can think of. And these aren't just working in students working in Latin American countries.
Right.
It's a student, because of her Spanish, ended up working in China. She
Wow.
learned Chinese. They had her working in a Hong Kong bank that was connected to Banco Santander in Spain. Or another student working in Russia, and he was involved in food distribution through Argentina. Or like a student who was working at a vineyard, and he got the vineyard job because of his Spanish to
Wow.
interact. And or my buddy who's an ER doctor, he keeps asking me, can you give lessons to our ER doctor friends? And so the lesson I kind of want just on that practical, because he knows you don't have to be fluent. You don't
Right.
have to be this high level, but just reaching out and interacting with someone in the language shows that you care and you're trying to connect and you're trying to reach
Right.
out to them in that way. And it's profound. And so it's not about being perfect and you're passing a test. And it was another former student I met at an alum reunion, and it was so long ago. He's a squirrely guy, and I was like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I'm actually an organ transplant surgeon." And I was like, "Whoa!" And
Wow.
he was like, "I use my Spanish all the time." And he's like, with kidney transplants, so many. And he goes, I remember the baseline level, but I so need it. And so in our world, so to be very clear, I'm absolutely not, I love science. I love history. I love other
Right.
disciplines. But in our world, what many students, and by our world, I mean our educational society, not just Kent Denver, it's like what many students in the US hear is, well, you better do STEM and you better do APs. Otherwise, your life is a wreck. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. You can do some STEM. And if there's some APs that interest you and you connect with,
Right.
absolutely. But there's this much vaster world out there. And again, you're going to hear this. I'm going to give this little spiel to your class soon. But what our students don't hear is the kind of message I hear from, it's a friend of mine who's on a medical school admissions board. And she was like, can you tell your students, if I see one more kid who's only done STEM in high school, like gone to a STEM high school and did pre-med and that's it, I'm going to lose my mind. And I was like, what do you want? She was like, well, they of course need the science classes. That's fine. She goes, they're going to have to take organic chemistry. Of course, I'm not saying no to that. But she goes, we want to see French majors. We want to see art history majors. We want to see people who are thinking in different ways. And the same thing was true of another friend who works for AT&T in the tech world. And he said, I said, what can you tell? I always ask my friends in corporate and stuff what recommendations they have. And he said, yeah, tell your students this. All your students are taking programming classes. And he said, nothing against programming, because that's what he does.
Right.
He said, we just fired 30,000 people, and this was a little while ago, to outsource, because
Wow.
he said we could get programmers so much cheaper in India. He goes, so all these kids going to fancy colleges in the United States just for programming. He goes, still you can do programming, do it.
Right.
But he
Right.
goes, if that's all you can do, he goes, if that's all you can do, we're going to outsource and you're going to lose your job to someone who's getting paid 1/10 what you would be
Wow.
getting paid. And so that's part of that kind of global message that I think some of our students don't hear. It's like, absolutely. And this, again, I want to make sure, like, this is where the soundbite would go viral. Senior Dawson doesn't believe in computer programming and doesn't believe in science. Absolutely not. But I'm saying yes. And so I've seen the trend over at schools like ours over the years where students and again, like, I love science. I think it's great, but students who feel the pressure, I feel like I need to take 3 science classes.
Right.
I have to get that in my schedule. And it's like, no, 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 no. Not only do you not need to start your major now, but you want to keep yourself kind of broad as well in college for a range of
Right.
reasons, both learning and experiences. So this is a message that is getting kind of lost in the greater US society. Like, Europeans get it. They have to speak
Of
many languages
course.
because of the proximity. Um, but a lot of Americans are like, well, I can kind of get by. And it's like, no, it's about this much vaster conversation. But
No.
anyway, you'll hear some of that spiel in a little bit. Oh, do you feel like I'm wrong in that, and some of those perceptions about um, validity of this? And by the way, like, I also will defend history for different reasons. I'll
Right.
defend art. What a lot of students are like, well, I don't really need art. It's like, oh my gosh, art expands your brain in a way. So yes, the brain benefits are tremendous in art. But then I say, well, think about, what does art connect to? When I ask students this, like, in the professional world, oh, nothing. Oh, really? What is design? That you look around in a room, where do you see design? I'm not talking Picasso art necessarily, but I'm like, everything that we are
Right.
using has been designed by someone. Um,
Right.
and so that's something that's kind of like, oh yeah, there's that. you know.
Right. It's
So
interesting. I think we're humans are very attached to our senses. And you mentioned art in a room. We have tall buildings, and a lot of people think, why do we have such beautiful buildings? Well, we do that to please our sight. We have tasty food. You think about, you could
mhm.
have a
Oh,
cup
right, right,
of
right,
rice and
absolutely.
beans, and that would have the same nutritional value as, if you were going to have fancy food, but you do it because you want to please your senses. And for me, at least,
Hmm.
learning a language pleases a sense that I don't think we talk about a lot, which is the cerebral aspect. I want to be challenged, and I want to be in an environment where maybe I don't know something. And that's where I think about language, because it's not, when you learn a language that isn't inherently your own, it is by its nature a challenge, because it's not, you weren't raised in this environment, but when you start to learn it, it's decoding, and maybe this is just my brain, but I love that sensation. And I think what you mentioned before also, what I want to go back to, is that Americans are kind of caught up in the idea that, oh, we have a phone, we can just translate. But I think people, and I've seen the expressions that people have when you speak their language, they're so delighted that you would take the time to be a part of their culture. And I want to get into that in a second too. But I remember that at a school event we had recently, there was a Spanish mother, and she spoke only Spanish, and she was in this room just desperately trying to connect with the people in the room that were only speaking English. And we were talking about, drugs and alcohol, and she wanted to be a part of the conversation, of course. But I remember when I was able to translate portions of what we were saying from English into Spanish, and the joy that it gave her. Not only that I was speaking Spanish, of course, she was probably, she liked that someone was speaking Spanish, but also that it gave her a window into a world that she wouldn't be able to see. And I think that's where she didn't get the opportunity to learn English. But because I have the opportunity to learn Spanish, it just gives me a window into so much more. And what you mentioned was, people decide that they only want to learn science, they only want to study, math, they only want to do this. Spanish is all of those things in a different window. It's all of those things in a different light. You can you can learn science and focus only on that, but learning Spanish allows you to do that in other countries, another language, another set of the population that you wouldn't be able to reach if you just knew science. So I do think that's really important.
Well, you know the quote, and I'm actually reading from Madame Sullivan's.
Oh, there you go.
Madame Sullivan has at the bottom of her email. She has, and I know you will know it, but the Nelson Mandela quote: "If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. But if you talk to him in his own language, that goes to his heart."
Yeah.
And that really speaks to, this kind of that connection. And
Right.
then you really know the language. So even if you have a baseline level of the language, you can still, that does go to the person's heart. But then if you know the language at a higher level, getting into idiomatic expressions and getting into the rhythms of the language,
Right.
I mean, that gets into this more visceral kind of just changing your own mental landscape, changing how you think, changing how you kind of deeply interact. I feel like every language resides in a different part of the body, and everyone speaks differently. And that was and I forget who, there's some king, I feel like it was one of the Habsburgs. And the line was, and by the way, before I give you this one, I'll get it slightly wrong. I love all languages, but I really love German too. And so when you tell Miss Miller this one, but he said, "When I speak to God in Spanish, I use French to speak to my lover, and I use German to speak to my horse." It was something like, but it was like each. And then I was talking to someone else recently, and I've noticed this with students, that in language classes, we're in some ways able to have more controversial conversations more easily, because it's almost like, I feel like a shield. It's almost
agree.
like, and I mentioned this as a teacher here who's not a language teacher, and she was like, "Oh my gosh," because my mom, who speaks another language, she would only talk about certain topics in her native language, and sometimes they'd be the more edgy topics, or vice versa. There's certain categories of topics shelved or connected to each language. So anyway, it's just interesting, language and identity.
Yeah, that is. And my next question here is, you've been to Mexico, obviously a Spanish speaking country. And I think America is very closely related to the Latin world. We have Spanish, of course, most of the schools that have language programs have Spanish, either primarily or in addition to other languages. But if they have a language program, they probably have Spanish, and that just goes to show how connected we are to Mexico and the Latin world. But I want to ask you, when you were in Mexico, and you've been to obviously more places than just Mexico, you've been to South America. What do you think the importance of language is to culture? We think of nation, I think a lot of people think of nation as a country. A nation is really a group of people, not necessarily bounded by borders. So how do you think language separates that nation from others and kind of gives it its own identity?
Oh, well, that is huge. And I've had this conversation with some students, because sometimes I'll hear about students who are like, "Yeah, I want to study international relations, or I want to study, whatever related to culture or poli-sci, something international, political science." And it's like, "Okay, what language are you going to connect to?" And, "Oh, no, I'm not really doing language." It's like, listen, and I tell them, it's like, you can't really immerse in culture. You can kind of study on a more surface level culture.
Right.
But you'll always be blocked from the deeper aspects of culture without language. And if you ever read, there's a book, a history written by a great journalist, but a history of the CIA called Legacy of Ashes. And the CIA, I mean, it really chronicles the CIA over the decades from its very beginnings. And it was a history of good old boys clubs and of a good old boys club, the former Ivy Leaguers and stuff. But a lot of these guys over the years, and they've changed now more. But back in the day, for decades, they were not aware of culture, not aware of language. And so there's story after story where, and there's one that was one of the CIA lead operatives was in Beirut, and a terrorist cell that he had been tracking caught him. And they said, "Wow, you don't even know how to speak any of our languages, and you're the region's expert. We're going to kill you now because of that." And there's they had the transcript in the book related to that. So yeah, like it connects so deeply. So that's like the large view, which I think a lot of people think, no,
Right.
culture is just kind of, I can go watch a dance or something. Um,
Yeah.
and when I say deeply like that, and it affects us in ways we're not even aware of, like the one of the basic examples I'll use with students is, but there are millions of these, is in English. We're not even, most of us aren't even aware of the metaphors that we all use all the time. So many metaphors, and a
Oh
metaphor
yeah.
for something like, in English, time is money, right?
Right.
And in English, we will say we spend time and we save time and we waste time. In Spanish, you don't spend and waste time, you only pass time. And so you
Right.
think about that one kind of little piece and how that connects to language and culture. And it's so subtle, but then you get into how different languages have different genders for things and how that makes you see the world differently. Or, there's been some economic research on Chinese, or some languages like Chinese doesn't have a future tense, and languages that
Right.
don't have future tenses, for some reason, those cultures have place greater value on saving money. And economists have
Interesting.
looked at this and say, wow. And the only theory, the best theory they can come up with is, if you don't have a future tense, it kind of maybe feels like the future is right now, so you better save. But if you have a
Interesting.
separate category for the future, it's almost like, well, that's kind of a far way
Puts it
off.
farther
So
away.
you think like, yeah, it's farther away. And then, as you've talked about and you've seen with language classes, what if you don't have subjunctive, or what if you have lots of subjunctive, and
Right.
how does that affect how you think? And then, so all the little untranslatable words, all the metaphors, all the different tense frameworks, and then to say nothing of the rhythms and pronunciations and body
Right.
language. I mean, those things are so deeply connected to what a culture is. And so
Right.
it's not denying, culture really has, you hear about like the three big aspects: information and achievement, but then there's that behavioral piece,
Right.
which is so deeply connected to language. Um, it's really part of who we are and how we think, how we see the world.
Now that yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the idiomatic expressions really, are a part of the culture because the way that we communicate is the way that we think. I think in English, obviously, but I think it goes to show that when someone starts learning Spanish or Chinese or, whatever language, that they start to dream in Spanish, that kind of it demonstrates how closely related languages to our thinking process. And like you mentioned, if you don't have a certain tense, that's going to change your outlook on life. We're getting to the end of here of the podcast, but one last thing that I want, that maybe if you have some advice for those who have learned a language but maybe don't use it on a daily basis. And I'll give you an example: students over the summer, I have this problem. What are some things
Mm-hmm.
that we can do, maybe not every day, but how can we maintain our language skills in these points of life?
Oh, it's a great question, and it's a great way to end too. And I get that a lot. There's a lot, especially in today's world. And so if you think about it, and it's sad almost. I get adults coming to me sometimes like, I want to do just what you're asking.
Right.
Can you give me a textbook so I can study grammar? And my first thing is like, okay, hold off. And the grammar is a piece, absolutely, but make that the background.
Right.
That's the kind of thing you can guide yourself through in a decent textbook or whatever, or even a book like 501 Spanish Verbs
Right.
with charts of verbs, and to get a sense of things. So that's the background, but that's not the first go-to. It always comes back to like what you see in class. It's the four skills: it's listening, reading, writing, and speaking.
Right.
And listening, if you do those things on a regular basis, and listening, reading, and writing, you won't get feedback on unless you know like somebody, um, and speaking, you won't get feedback on unless you know somebody. But even journaling some on your own, and self speaking, just talking to yourself, can be helpful. But in the meantime, listening and reading like crazy, and doing
Right.
that every day, that input. And there's so much research in the language world on that, even and especially when you feel like you don't understand a lot of what you're reading or listening
Right.
to, letting it wash over you, trying to focus, trying to see like, what did I get of that? Okay, I got a little this much. Let me try it again. And there's so much out there, whether it's watching shows on Netflix in Spanish with Spanish subtitles, or leaving the subtitles out, or a whole world of kind of videos, or find things that interest you, or watching or reading magazines like Muy Interesante. So
Right.
you start with that input, and it's actually called that. It's a Mexican science magazine that has fun little articles. But You read, listen, and then that next stage would be, and I've seen people do it even if they don't have someone grading and giving them feedback. You journal a little bit, and just the act of doing that builds proficiency. Every now and then you want to get it checked so you don't fossilize mistakes.
Right.
In the same way with speaking, but yeah, so listening, reading, writing, speaking all the time.
Well, that's a great way to end the podcast here today. I'd like to thank Mr. Dawson for being on the program, and make sure to check out episode 6 coming this weekend. We're going to be discussing some of the similar topics that we talked about today regarding language and its importance. But I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and as always, tell someone you love them, make someone smile, and goodbye.